Well, hello everyone. Great to see you. Welcome to our ninth, would you believe it is our ninth Coastal Connections workshop, where our theme for today is assessing risk and vulnerability. It's the latest in our series of international workshops showcasing examples of how coastal heritage sites are addressing the impacts of climate change around the world. If you don't know me already, I'm Dr. Alex Kent and I lead the Coastal Connections project, which is a joint initiative between World Monuments Fund and English Heritage to build a global network for sharing knowledge, experience, and practical solutions amongst those who manage or care for coastal heritage. Again, it's a global network. So far, we have around 40 sites in the Coastal Connections Network. So if you manage or care for a site and would like to join us, please get in touch through our website. We're really glad to have you on board with our network. So please make sure you do that. Just a little bit about World Monuments Fund and English Heritage. Well, if you don't know already, headquartered in New York, World Monuments Fund is the leading independent organization devoted to safeguarding the world's most treasured places to enrich people's lives and build mutual understanding across cultures and communities. With affiliate offices in other countries, including the UK, here where Coastal Connections is based, it's been involved in over 800 heritage conservation projects since it was founded in 1965. So we'll be celebrating our 60th anniversary next year. We're looking forward to that. English Heritage is a charity that cares for over 400 sites and their collections in England for the benefit of this and for future generations. Its work is informed by the values of authenticity, quality, imagination, responsibility, and fun, the best one. And its vision is that people will experience the story of England where it really happened. So if you're joining us today, particularly from a heritage site or really wherever you're from, then please do feel free to say hello in the chat, say where. We'd really like to know whereabouts you're coming from. And usually we have a really nice spread around the world. So that's fantastic if you can do that. What we'll do today, as usual, if you're not familiar with how these run, we'll hear from our speakers first, and then we'll have a brief Q&A session for a few minutes, and then we'll discuss the topic in breakout rooms, what we've been talking about today. So what I'm going to do now is head over to, or hand over, I should say, to Rob Woodside, who's a heritage professional. He has been for over 25 years. He's Director of Conservation and Estates for English Heritage, where he's responsible for the conservation and maintenance of the National Heritage Collection of over 400 ancient monuments and historic buildings across England. And he also leads the development and implementation of the English Heritage Sustainable Conservation Strategy. And if you don't know already, Rob's nomination of Hurst Castle to the 2022 World Monuments Watch, WMF's biannual call to action, led then to the creation of the Coastal Connections programme. So we're really pleased that you're with us, Rob, and thanks very much indeed for joining us and introducing this topic of risk and vulnerability. Thanks very much indeed.
Well, thank you very much, Alex. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Loud and clear. Great. Okay. So we're going to focus this evening on risk and vulnerability. And my introduction is just to sort of tease out some of the thoughts and around the concepts of risk and vulnerability. Other speakers this evening are going to go into much more depth. But for me, this is really critical in trying to understand what we're dealing with in terms of environmental change. Can I have the first slide, please? There we go. So Alex did mention we're building up quite a network here. And you can see sites all around the world where we've already engaged. And we started this program, the series of seminars last January. And we started the question of why does coastal heritage matters? And of course, we've heard from people over that time from everywhere from Antarctica to Zanzibar, all of whom have brilliantly articulated the case for conservation, adaptation, and change. And it's essential that we keep on asking ourselves why cultural heritage is of value in the face of increasing risk. We know, of course, that the concept of value around cultural heritage is constantly evolving. We're not just talking about bricks and mortars, artifacts, or even practices and intangible heritage. Rather, it's what they mean to us as a society today. Cultural heritage is increasingly recognized as being vital to help shape culture and identity, adding economic value for tourism and jobs, influencing environmental sustainability, supporting UN Sustainable Development Goals, contributing to net zero reduction and building resilience to climate change. This is big stuff that we're dealing with here. And when we're looking at the coast, we recognize the scale of what we're dealing with. About 2% of the world's land mass falls in what's known as the low elevation coastal zone. That's land less than 10 meters above sea level. This can include some of the world's biggest megacities, New York, Bangkok, vulnerable small island states in the Pacific and the Caribbean, low-lying states such as Bangladesh and the Netherlands, and great coastal estuaries, including the Nile and the Mekong deltas. That includes about 11% of the world's population, nearly 1 billion people. So the sheer scale, diversity, and significance of the tangible and intangible coastal heritage in these regions is therefore extraordinary. From major World Heritage sites to indigenous spoken languages, it tells a story of our relationship with the sea, with nature, and with each other over continents. And that story can often be complex and challenging as much as it can be uplifting and inspiring. But the legacies of cities, monuments, and living cultures that line our shores is vital to help us better understand our place in the world and the challenges we face. Next slide, please. Now, because of its location, coastal heritage is, of course, perceived as being at risk, particularly from climate change. In that case, it's looking at sea level rise, storm events, tidal surge, extreme heat, and exceptional weather events. But this may be one factor amongst others that increases the vulnerability and risk these sites face. That may include neglect, insufficient maintenance, sites which are simply not being cared for, urban growth, infrastructure development, tourism expansion, disruption to natural processes, degradation of natural habitats, pollution, and loss of traditional livelihoods and practices. Poor coastal planning and adaptation can also have a secondary impact. So measures being put in to already tackle things like coastal erosion can impact on heritage. So these factors, which are often interrelated, are increasing the risk of damage, collapse, and loss of coastal heritage, which has implications for public safety, increased costs, loss of tourism, and erosion of local cultural identity. But is every coastal site at risk? What criteria do we need to consider in order to make a judgment about how we might lead into and mitigate that risk, assuming, of course, we can? Next one, please. So how do we evaluate risk? Well, two factors that often arise when talking about climate change and other potential hazards are risk and vulnerability. What I find that these two terms are often quite closely interchangeably used. Heritage sites are seen at risk or vulnerable to climate hazards and development. They're seen to mean the same thing, but are they? Well, not quite. I know that other speakers will go into a lot more depth this evening, but generally, when people talk about risk, they're talking about the multiplication of impact and likelihood. So, what might happen and how likely is it going to happen? So, in the case of here at Hurst Castle, we knew that the impact of collapse would be quite catastrophic. So, if you had a collapse in the structure caused by the structure being undercut by wave action, and the likelihood of that being very high, meant that we always knew the site was at great risk. But it only gave us one dimension of understanding of that. Next slide, please. So in terms of how we think about climate risk, we need to explore the concept of vulnerability. And this definition by the IPCC, I think, is very useful. It's the general definition. So we're in the context of climate risk impacts. Risks result from dynamic interactions between climate-related hazards with the exposure and vulnerability of the affected human or ecological system to the hazards. Well, quite techie, but basically what it means is we're looking at two fundamental areas there. It's about exposure, vulnerability in relation to hazards. So in this case, vulnerability encompasses a variety of concepts and elements, including sensitivity or susceptibility to harm, and our lack of capacity or potential capacity to cope with that change or adapt to it. Next slide, please. So I think there's some very useful concepts when we're talking about cultural heritage. We start with trying to understand the concept of vulnerability. And we have to say, well, what's driving that? What are the hazards we face? Now, there are clear climate hazards, which are already listed, and also there are non-climate hazards, which actually may be either be accelerated by climate change or actually are already ameliorating the situation. So we can't see climate and any other factors in isolation. It has to be a holistic view, I think, of understanding hazards. Then there's a consideration of exposure. just because something's by the coastline, does it actually mean that it's at risk? It depends on how exposed it might well be to those kind of hazards. And also to fundamentally, it's understanding about sensitivity. How sensitive are they? Now, a lot of heritage, coastal heritage, is built by the sea, and it's pretty formidable. You know, castles, forts, monuments, what have you, they're fairly robust. However, if you take someone like Hurst Castle, the whole castle is highly vulnerable because of its sensitivity to the loss of shingle, and it was the loss of shingle which actually led to the beach being cut away and this substantial physical structure which was built to withhold, you know, armaments and from far passing ships, led to its collapse. So it's one of those things, like however robust and solid you think it is, unless you actually understand the detail of what's happening and some of the intricacies of the site, it really does challenge you. And then there's a question of adaptive capacity, which I think is really, really important, because you can understand all these risks and you can understand all these different factors, but you have to question whether or not you can do very much about it. And your adaptive capacity might be the knowledge, the understanding, the resources of an organization. It may be the physical aspects of what you're doing. Can you actually do anything to manage this change and manage this risk? And if you can't, then it's going to increase your vulnerability, because actually what you can't do is mitigate it or adapt, or you don't either have, or you may not have the skills, money, or political will to do it. So you've got to think about adaptive capacity in this broader thinking. Next one, please. So some final thoughts when we go into this concept of vulnerability. I think that I know this is quite a busy field. There's a lot of people asking these questions, and I've seen the sort of the number of studies and working programs looking at vulnerability really increase over the years. But the question is, are we talking the same language? Are we all using the same terms? Are we got a sort of commonality between us? Are we all slightly different nuances in everything we do? So can we find a consistent approach to this? Can we make sure that what we're talking about, climate vulnerability for coastal heritage in, let's say, Thailand, is that the same as what we might be talking about in the Caribbean, for example? You know, that's where are the differences? Are we on the same page? And also fundamentally some thoughts of, are we really listening to the people who care and understand most about their cultural heritage? Which I mean, of course, is about local people. So we can have all of the most fantastic conceptual models we like for these things, but if we're not really engaging with people who live with their heritage or care for their heritage on a day-to-day basis, do we really understand it? Because what they might see as significant or what they might see as being vulnerable might be very different for different kind of perspectives. So it's always important that we we absolutely have that at the heart of what we're doing. We're going to finish there with those thoughts. Maybe we want to come back to them as we go through the questions. But Alex, back over to you in terms of introducing our next speaker.
Great. Thank you very much indeed, Rob, for that really stimulating introduction and really helpful to get us thinking about those different approaches and obviously different perspectives on risk around the world, which is so important to appreciate and understand. So that's great. Let's move straight on then to the first speaker that we have, who's going to talk about a specific case, if you like. So this is Dr. Paul Lankester. Paul, my colleague, the English Heritage Sustainability Team Climate Resilience Lead. Paul's PhD research looked at the impact of climate change on historic interiors. Following this, he worked as a conservation scientist at English Heritage for 11 years. In 2023, he moved into the new Climate Resilience Lead role, and his work now then focuses on understanding the impact of climate change on English heritage, informing how the organisation can adapt and to ensure the sites in their care are climate resilient. That work that he's doing is generously supported by the Benefact Group. So, Paul, really glad to have you with us, and please take it away. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. And can you hear me okay?
Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
Great. Can I have the next slide, please? Okay, so, excuse me, thinking about climate resilience at English Heritage. So we want to understand what the impact of climate change would be on our sites. We all hear that sea level is going to rise and temperatures are going to increase and so on across lots of thoughts around those areas across different climate hazards. But we wanted to understand at each of our sites, what does that actually mean? So now we've done some assessment of the climate projections to understand that at Hurst Castle, the sea level is going to rise by 78 centimetres off the top of my head, whereas at a different site, sea level rise is going to be a little bit different. And we understand that, for example, at Kenwood House in London, the temperature is going to increase by a certain amount, depending on which climate projection you look at and where in time you're going to take that piece of data, and that will be different elsewhere. And so we want to build that into a national climate change risk assessment, which is the first part of work that I looked at, to try and, across our whole estate, the National Heritage Collection of over 400 buildings and a million collection objects and gardens and landscapes and so on, how can we prioritise those sites to look at them individually, to then really start to understand how each individual site may be impacted by climate change? And that's the second part of the work that I'm looking at. So it's the site-specific climate change risk assessments, which we've developed a methodology and looked at 5 different pilot sites to test that. And we'll get into the details of both these, the national and the site-specific risk assessments, shortly. This is all to understand how we need to adapt and build resilience to climate change at our sites. And I always put this note at the bottom that we need to remember it's not just risks, it's opportunities potentially. Also, the next slide, please. Excuse me. For the national risk assessment, I think about this as a big jigsaw puzzle. The picture's starting to get there, but without a picture overall that I'm trying to now build from all the different data sources. So there's lots of data around, primarily around future risks, so these hazards from climate change, so sea level rise, temperature increase, and so on and so on. But as we've heard from Rob, we need more than this. We need to think about the whole risk assessment model. So this is from the IPCC. We can see in the bottom right-hand corner, which looks at exposure, vulnerability, and response as well. And this, as I said, helps us prioritise individual sites for further assessment. So we can have the next slide, please. Here we have an example to try and help understand that a little bit more with some sites that English Heritage cares for on the coast. And I think Alex can tell us later on, but his house is probably just around somewhere near Deal Castle here. So Deal Castle to the north here, and then we've got Walmer Castle and Gardens to the south, just a mile apart from each other. So the future climate projections here are the same for each site. The local conditions are relatively similar. So yeah, that future data is the same, which is where we need to then look at exposure and vulnerability and response to understand how each of these sites will be impacted differently. In the middle, we've got Walmer Castle. In the bottom right-hand side, we've got Deal Castle. In the top right-hand corner, we've got the Duke of Wellington's bedroom at Walmer Castle. And this shows an example of how Walmer Castle is displayed. It's very much a historic house setting with collections on open display, which is very different to Deal Castle. It's much more sparsely furnished with collections. So in this instance, we'd say that Walmer Castle is more exposed with respect to the collections than Deal Castle is. We can think about this from other aspects as well. So in terms of visitors or people on site, Walmer Castle has many more visitors than Deal Castle. So again, we'd say this is more exposed with respect to the visitors. We can think about vulnerability. So Walmer Castle, there's currently an issue with the roof at Walmer Castle, which we have a project looking at. But we've had some instances of rainwater ingress into the Walmer Castle, causing issues with the collection and so on. At Deal Castle, there's a small problem with the roof, a much lesser extent than at Walmer Castle. So we'd say Walmer Castle is more vulnerable to any future increase in rainfall intensity. Okay, and next slide, please. So this is an example of some of the data that I've started to pull together. There's lots of information here, but picking out some of the specific information around vulnerability. So we've got a health and safety reporting system, which is referred to as PRIME. We can see here I've picked out the reports of water leaks, which relate to the weather specifically. And over this time period of 2017 to 23, we've had 26 rainwater ingress reports at Walmer. So this is kind of information that we're starting to try and pull together when we're looking at all of our sites, how we may be able to start to prioritise across the estate. We can see we've got external fires here as well. So this is trying to understand risk to wildfire and potential ignition sources. So if we've got antisocial behaviour, for example, at different sites, then this starts to help us understand those vulnerabilities. In the garden and landscapes part, we can see information around reports of large branches or trees falling, and so again starting to understand that potential vulnerability if storminess may increase in the future. And various data points here around people to understand their exposure, so how many staff and volunteers, and categories, the visitor numbers as a category out of 5. Next slide, please. And again, this slide, lots more data, and most of this is around future climate projections. But if we look at the coastal risk line, there's a few boxes which are called coastal risk and priority places. This was a risk assessment that I'll talk more about shortly. We can see erosion here is 0, and then the next couple of boxes is NSERM, so this is the National Coastal Erosion Risk Mapping. And this is showing that there's no coastal erosion expected at Walmer Castle, and this is because the site is defended and will continue to be defended in the future. But we've also got this other piece of data that we have at Walmer, but available for all of our sites, is the susceptibility to erosion. So we can start to build up that picture around vulnerability also. And next slide, please. Okay, so lots of data already that I've shown, but there's more data. There's a very long list of what I'd like to add into this national risk assessment, while still making sure it's relatively quick and simple to undertake, so that we can really get to look at individual sites, which is where we can understand how we need to adapt. So we could add in vulnerability of different materials to different climate hazards where we have that information, and that there's another point there around research and what research we need to do to help build our understanding of those climate risks and how they may become impacts. And we could introduce where we have wall paintings to understand where we've got an increased vulnerability of our building fabric. And we could add in future flood risk projections, which hopefully will come out early next year in the UK. And we could add in information around site staffing, which relates to response. If you've got people on site more frequently, you can respond and mitigate any potential impacts. And then planned investment, I think this is quite an important one to consider that we'll try and add into the risk assessment. If we've got a project on site and we're making large investments at those sites, it's a point in time where we're particularly vulnerable to making poor decisions. And if we made poor decisions, we're locking those in for a long time. So if we can make well-informed, climate-informed decisions, we can make sure the lifetimes of those projects are further into the future. So my aim, one of the next steps, is to build rapid risk assessments per hazard. And we can see an example here with the coastal risk and priority places work that Historic England undertook a few years ago. And you can access this report with the link at the bottom here. So this is a good start to understanding that risk. And with a risk assessment, I think there's a few tweaks that may be needed. When we look at English heritage, it flags up one site, which is a site which will be defended in the future. So yeah, a little bit of tweaking there, but it's a pretty good, quick assessment to understand coastal risk. And next slide, please.
You've got about a minute left, Paul. Okay.
Thank you, Alex. So moving on to site-based climate change risk assessments, I developed a process a workshop process on site with our stakeholders for those colleagues who understand and are experts in different areas of each site, so site manager, building conservation manager, and so on, and talk through with them the site-specific issues. Then I can add in the climate projection information and try and work through those risks and understand how they may then manifest as impacts. And we break this down across those 5 themes in the top right-hand corner. And I feel this is important because a risk to one of these collections, for example, may manifest quite differently for the operational aspect of our sites. And so it's important to look at the impacts across those different themes. And the aim of developing adaptation pathways, as we see here, which are available from the Into website. And next slide, please. So future plans is for us to develop this national risk assessment further. The next point, please, and next few. And then to develop a dashboard, similar to what we've seen here, to be able to provide all this information to my colleagues at English Heritage so that they can start to make climate-informed decisions themselves with guides and a toolkit to support this before they come to me as a consultant almost, and case studies to support this. And next point as well, please. And then this point around, we need further targeted research to really understand how certain climate hazards may come together and compound to then cause impacts. At the moment, we don't understand this well enough in certain areas and need to do further research. And the next phase that I'm aiming to think about a lot is around indicators. So these indicators are very much how we decouple the uncertainty of climate change at our sites, so from the climate projections, and understand precisely how climate change will have an impact at our site. So we track the indicators at each site to really then understand that, rather than relying on the climate projections themselves. The next slide, please. And I shall skip this for time. So this is just going over and summarising what I just said. Apart from the last point of, it's really important to embed climate resilience in the organisational processes, so that you're finding these opportunities all the time, rather than just relying on trying to undertake individual adaptations. You're doing this with the business as usual of the organisation as such. Thank you very much.
Lovely, great. Thank you so much, Paul. Really, really interesting to see how you're approaching this with an English Heritage. And what can I say but great choice of sites at the beginning of Walmer Castle. And again, just reiterates the power of that difference that you can see. Initially very similar sites when they were built, and then in similar periods, and then obviously developed in very different ways, but facing different elements of vulnerability. And that's a really important thing, even though they're very close together geographically. So great, thanks very much. I should say, if people have got questions, feel free to put them in the chat, and then we'll pose them to the panel all at the end after the last person has spoken. So we'll then see if we can deal with those all in one go, which would be great. Right, now let's move, must be 10,000 miles at least, to New Zealand. And here, Tony, we're very glad, Tony, that you're able to join us so early for you. So thank you for this. So Tony Moore, Professor Moore is Dean of University of Otago School of Surveying and a professor specialising in geographical information science, particularly cartography and geovisualisation. His work often has a coastal application. For the last 3 years, he's been part of the Strand team, a Royal Society of New Zealand funded project to study climate change related risks to coastal property values. So thanks very much indeed, Tony, for joining us, and over to you. Look forward to what you have to say. Thanks.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you. I'll be presenting on an aspect of the project Strand that Alex just introduced. In particular, trying to relate that work to coastal heritage and the coastal cultural asset risk. The project is a multi-institutional project. The institutions you see here, University of Otago, Bologna Scientific, GS Science, Griffith University, and many more. Next slide, please. And so that project is designed to assess climate change risks to property values across space and time, and relate it to financial stability. And I'll be only talking about a very specific part of it, a multi-criteria evaluation applied to assets, in particular to try and model risk. And as I said, I will relate that to cultural assets. Next slide, please. First off, though, Rob and Paul's presentations made clear that there are many conflicting definitions. So I just wanted to kind of relay my take on definitions of risk and associated objectives, which aligns with the IPCC one that Paul actually defined. So risk here from the IPCC definition, the potential for the consequences where something of value is at stake or where the outcome is uncertain. And in this multi-criteria evaluation kind of knowledge model, which I'm about to introduce, It's a function of objectives of vulnerability, hazard, exposure, and resilience. So next point, please. So we've got vulnerability, likelihood that assets will be damaged or destroyed or affected when exposed to a hazard. Next point, and remaining points for this slide, please. Hazard is a potentially destructive physical phenomenon, like a flood, groundwater induced instance, etc. Exposure, we've got those assets that are exposed to the hazard and the function of vulnerability as to whether they're affected or not. And resilience, the capacity of social, economic, and environmental systems to cope with hazardous event, trend, or disturbance. So with that understanding, we'll go forward. The next slide, thanks. So this is a knowledge model that I referred to and the basis for the multi-criteria evaluation. So I've only got time to really go through a kind of a hypothetical run through linking to cultural and heritage aspects. So we've got a three-tier hierarchy here. At the top of the hierarchy, the top tier, we've got the goal, where we're trying to establish risk, coastal asset risk. It's a function of those four objectives I mentioned earlier. Second tier down, and underneath those objectives, there are criteria, specific criteria that we can basically model using GIS and also knowledge. So, for instance, under vulnerability, we've got elevation of slope, which basically affects how kind of critical the hazard impacts the coast. We've got hazards themselves. We've got sea level rise, and we've got groundwater, as previously mentioned, storm surges, and so on. Exposure is where the cultural and heritage assets comes in. These are the things that could be lost due to hazards and future sea level rise. So GDP representing the value of property, the cultural sites themselves, and this can be a distance function from the coast. And then we've got resilience, the human and infrastructural response frameworks in case of an incident. So, for instance, road density talks to basically access to the coast for emergency services. The ratio of child/elderly to working population referred to there reflects the, I guess, proportion of people who are more able to help out in the case of emergency. Okay. Next slide, thanks. And we can take this forward into this multi-criteria evaluation. So this slide is really designed to give you an illustration of where this is placed in the wider project of Strand. So a lot of activity are to do with what you see there on the left, which is a physical modelling of the effects of sea level rise on property loss. And the graph you see is a dual graph where to the end of the century, as groundwater rises with rising sea level, and you see that the blue kind of peaks there, these are storm incidents which kind of break the surface of the ground. As that happens, there's an overall trend of rising property price, but you can see with each incident the property price plummets, and normally it recovers as there are no floods imminent in the immediate future. But there will come a time when the floods do come at a very more increased rate, and basically at some point the banks will stop basically giving mortgages for such risky properties. So there's a team in the project who are working to establish at what point that happens. But we recognise that this modelling only covers the physical hazard stroke vulnerability aspects, impacting on just one exposure aspect, which is the property. And we can see that next couple of clicks, please. We can see that it doesn't cover resilience or aspects of exposure like cultural sites, for instance. Next slide, please. And so this is the multi-criteria evaluation technique. On the left there, we've got the knowledge that I've just outlined. It goes into a multi-criteria evaluation process called AHP, which I won't go into. Just it will calculate weights of importance for each of the objectives and the criteria that I mentioned. Those weights are then multiplied by spatial data sets representing each of the criteria. So, for instance, we've got one for elevation, we've got one for cultural sites, and these are normalized and multiplied by weightings to create objective indices, which can then be combined to basically calculate the overall index, the overall risk index. Next slide, please. And the way we do this, we ask a group of experts to pairwise weight objectives and criteria, and we do this for an online form. Next slide, please. And so here we've got a couple of examples. On the left, we have objective pairwise weighting. We've got two objectives here, vulnerability and hazard. In the middle, we've got a slider scale, and in the middle, we've got a situation where the expert has rated vulnerability and hazard as being equal importance, but they can slide a scale to either end if they think, for instance, to the left, if they think vulnerability is more important than hazard, and the degree is sliding to the left. If you go right to the end, that is the vulnerability being extremely more important than hazard, and to the extreme to the right is hazard extremely more important than vulnerability. And we've got a similar sliding scale for each of the criteria. And so here we've got on the right a wider set of criteria for vulnerability, where the expert can pairwise weight elevation versus slope, elevation versus ground composition, geology, geomorphology, and so on, and all other pairwise combinations of these six criteria you see here in the same way. And you can see at the bottom that the expert can actually rate their own confidence in providing that weighting. Next slide, please. So in the next slide, we've got a sample set of pairwise weightings for objectives. And here you see in the middle, for instance, that someone has rated at the top there, an expert's rated vulnerability in the first row as being 5 times more important than hazard, to use that slider scale input. And you can see there all other pairwise weightings. Another 3 clicks, please. And you can see just to the right of that central column, we've brought in cultural assets, distance of cultural assets, and it's been pitted against pairwise personal income, and that first expert has rated cultural assets as being 5 times as important as personal income in the definition of exposure. So experts provide these pairwise weightings. It goes into the analytical hierarchy process, which calculates a single weight for each objective, each criterion. Next slide, please.
Just under a minute left, Tony. Okay.
Thanks, Alex. So here we've got a mock-up set of weights. You notice that each of the objective weights add up to 1, and you can see exposure has about 20% of that. Each of the criterion weights, there are 2 criteria for each objective. And for the 2 exposure criteria, you can see that distance cultural has nearly 3/4 of the weighting. And this is the culmination of all the experts' knowledge as provided to the system. Next slide, please. And then you multiply those weights by these normalized rasters. This is coastal Otago. Dunedin is kind of approximately central to that. And these have been normalized from 0 to 1. Okay. Next slide, please. And then these are basically amalgamated to provide a single risk map like this. We zoom into Dunedin and we see a range of risk, and I should stress that the lighter color is higher risk, the dark color is lower risk. We can do thresholding on the right there to basically kind of isolate areas that are more at risk. And that 0.8 threshold there reflects the areas in the local area where I live that are most at risk and have been affected before by, say, flooding. Next slide and the last slide. So in summary, I've outlined an aspect of the Strand project, and that aspect is basically a run through of how we calculate a coastal asset risk index. We're related to cultural assets as one of the criteria under exposure. Our next steps with this, and we're applying for more funding for a continuation of this project, is basically a larger scope model where we approach financial and coastal experts for their knowledge. So I showed you a set of six criteria for vulnerability in the previous slide. We're going to go on that scale to experts from those sectors. We're going to build in data quality, data veracity, and fuzziness. I can explain these concepts in questions if you're curious. And longer term, we want to go to a multi-scale approach, and also build in more financial, cultural, social, and behavioural criteria as well. So, last slide. Thanks very much for listening. Cheers.
Great. Thank you very much indeed, Tony. And it's good to see some questions coming into the chat already. Please feel free to add some to that. We won't probably have time to answer all of them, but we'll do our best. So thanks again, Tony. That was great. Great to have your perspectives from New Zealand and the approaches that you're adopting there. So we're now going to move to Alessandra Bonazza in Italy. Alessandra, you're a senior researcher at the Institute of Atmospheric Sciences and Climate of the National Research Council of Italy, where you coordinate the research unit impacts on environment, cultural heritage, and human health. Alessandra has got a PhD in Earth Sciences and is a adjunct professor at the University of Bologna. She's an expert in climate change and pollution impact and cultural heritage, risk assessment and vulnerability analysis, hence why you've kindly agreed to our invitation to speak. So thank you very much indeed, Alessandra. Over to you. Let's get on.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Alex, also for this invitation. So may I have the first slide, please? So I would like to start by highlighting some of the key points that has been raised in the documents that you can see here in this slide in relation to what has been done in terms of safeguarding cultural and natural heritage at risk in a climate change context. So one of these documents has been published by the European Commission in 2018, and the second one is more recent, 2 years ago. And both documents have highlighted how much we still to work in order to transfer the research result to the policies. So in order to have culture in policies, adaptation and mitigation policies. And unfortunately, in these documents also has been highlighted how much is it important to have a commonly joint methodology for the evaluation of risk assessment, vulnerability assessment of the different cultural assets that are located. I mean, these documents are related mainly to cultural heritage located in Europe, but of course, how much is it important also to have this methodology and transfer the methodology to other contexts in the world. But also it has been highlighted how much culture and cultural heritage could be a solution for improving the resilience of society in facing climate change. So that's to say that fortunately we had increased attention to the problem of safeguarding cultural heritage in climate change context. Next slide, please. But the thing strange is that the research that has been now done for the protection of cultural heritage in facing and tackling the risk imposed by climate change is not so recent. So we had our first project founded by the European Commission, the NOAAR project in 2004. And within this project, the first projections and scenarios by giving quantification of damage, the type of damage that you can see here listed in this slide, deriving from the ongoing changes of climate and pollution parameters and the impact on specific building materials have been produced within this project. So within this project, 20 years ago, we started to talk about heritage climatology, so to consider climate by taking into consideration which should be the parameters to measure, to monitor, and which type of data we could have from climate modeling in order to have quantification of the damage occurring on our cultural heritage assets, but with a long and term view. So the most important also is to have projections, so to use the outputs from climate models in order to have scenarios in the near and the far future. In this way, we can be prepared for facing what is going on because climate change. So the first studies are related to these scenarios in terms of slow cumulative change by using, for example, damage functions that allowed us to quantify the damage in terms, for example, of surface recession due to the impact of rain because of the chemical dissolution imposed by rain and pollution on specific materials, or, for example, the cohesion and stress physical damage, therefore, on material because of solar radiation changes and heating. This is another point, for example. Or the cohesion because of salt deriving from different sources, like, for example, rising damp, sea water, or other type of sources, like, for example, the atmospheric one. Next slide, please. But the most important thing is that with this data, you can see one of the projections that has been produced for the next, for the period far future 2007 and the end of this century, for example, on thermal stress. Fortunately, we were able to transfer all this data for the one of the documents you can see here, which is a policy document, climate and environmental coastal risk in the Mediterranean, that has been issued by the experts on climate and environmental change. And fortunately here, finally, we have in this document that will be published by the end of the year, a section dedicated to cultural heritage protection. This is really, I mean, sporadic, unfortunate, because we do not have enough this transfer of research into strategies for the protection of cultural heritage, which are included in the reports and in the policies at national and international level, like, for example, the IPCC report. So in the IPCC report, still, we do not have specific strategies and measures for the protection of cultural heritage. And this is, of course, a big issue to face. Next slide, please. And by using also this work and the damage functions and also outputs from climate models, we were able also to produce maps, like, for example, what is going on in terms of climate change impact on Panamanian UNESCO heritage sites. So this is an example of the work that we have also done, transferring the methodology that has been set up at European level outside Europe and started to work also in other contexts, like, for example, Latin America. Next slide, please. One of the problems that we have by using outputs from climate models is the spatial resolution of the data. So we have to work, for example, in downscaling of the spatial resolution that we have in terms of climate and pollution parameters, because, of course, the projections that we can have are at territorial level and do not go so much into detail in the building scale. We have other projects running, like, for example, the one you can see here, the Interreg Central European Project Strange and Protect to Save, and the next one in the next slide, which is the INACO one. Next slide, please, which is actually under development. It started in June of this year. And here, finally, we are more working on the impact of extreme events. So extreme variations of temperature and precipitation on cultural heritage assets and natural ones at European level, more specifically in Central European regions. And here we are working by using, again, outputs from the climate models, but by improving the scale, spatial scale, by passing from a coarse scale to a more finer one, by using, for example, outputs that are in this context are of 9 kilometers per 9 kilometers. Next slide, please. Here we are considering risk assessment as function of hazard, vulnerability. In the vulnerability, we have included the exposure, and I'm going to show the methodology in another slide. And for hazard mapping, we are taking and we are using the outputs from the climate models, the Eurocodex simulation, as I was saying, with a spatial resolution of 10 kilometers per 10 kilometers or 9. But also we are taking into consideration the data that could arrive from the Copernicus program, so satellite data. That's to see that we can have a picture of the past, what is happening nowadays, but also the most important thing is also to have projections for the future. So scenario with a long and short-term perspective in order to be able at the end to set up preparedness strategies. Of course, these evaluations, as you can see here, covers a period of 30 years, because of course we need to have this time span in order to be able to make comparison, future and the past, and being able really to face and to make evaluation in relation to the climate change impact. So we can define a changing climate if the analysis is at least done for a time scale of 30 years. This is one point. Otherwise, it is forecasting. It is not climate change, predictions or scenarios. And we are working, therefore, at regional scale with these projections, but the vulnerability assessment is more a building scale. We are considering extreme events related to extreme variations of temperature and precipitation, floods, heavy rain, prolonged drought periods mainly, and like, for example, fires that could occur because in a more favorable condition because of drought period. Next, please. This is an example of these maps. So we are calculating specific climate risk indexes, like, for example, air 20 millimeters. More than risk indexes are hazard indexes because we are looking at the hazard. Air 20 millimeters is related to very heavy precipitation days. Air per 5 day allow us to see the highest 5-day precipitation amount. And this, for example, index is very useful for making calculation and analysis of flood risk, for example, or consecutive dry days, which are related to prolonged drought period. Here we are in the, could you go next? Because there is an animation, I think, and there is yeah, thank you so much. And this is the area that we are taking into consideration in a project at national level, the Emilia-Romagna coastal area. And all these projections that are looking at what is happening in the far future, shows that all these indexes are foreseen to increase. Therefore, all the area will be at risk more because of these extreme events like heavy precipitation or flood and drought. And you can see here some of the examples of the natural park in the Po Plain, which is our case study. So therefore, not only building, not only built heritage, but also natural one, of course. Next slide, please.
Just under a minute.
Yeah, sure. So concerning the vulnerability ranking or the vulnerability methodology, we are considering 3 major requirements: susceptibility, exposure, and resilience. So we have included, the exposure in our vulnerability methodology. That's to say that this vulnerability methodology that we have set up, that we have developed, it is still under further development. It has been built and created with really very interactive and consultation, process and consultation with the stakeholders since the beginning. So we were working with surveys, local working tables, and also awareness raising events in order to define the criteria that are involved in the definition of the 3 different requirements, in order to be able also to give a weight of each criteria. And of course, taking into consideration which are the real needs when a cultural heritage need to be safeguarded, protected, and managed. And just to say that, for example, that on one of the requirements, the resilience one, we have considered the preparedness capacity, the coping capacity, restorative capacity, and one of the most important criteria for the preparedness capacity is policy and regulation. Therefore, to have risk management plans that include also the protection of the cultural heritage assets. Next slide, please. And finally, this last slide is showing another case study that we are following in Italy, the Aeolian Island, which is a small archipelago in the north of Sicily, in the south of Italy. And here is just to represent how much it's important to consider cultural heritage in the very holistic approach by considering not only the tangible part, but also the intangible part, and therefore the knowledge and the traditional, for example, technique that are applied, has been applied in the past. We are here talking about a terraced landscape, and the dry walling stone technique is considered, and that has been also included in the UNESCO Intangible Heritage List because of its importance in keeping protected the landscape and more resilient in facing hydrogeological risk. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much indeed, Alessandra. It's fascinating, really, really useful to see the different facets of different types of geospatial information that you're incorporating in all this as well, including the satellite imagery from Copernicus. So thank you for that. Right, let's move straight then to Michelle, staying more or less in the Mediterranean, going to Malta. Michelle, then, just to tell you who Michelle is. Michelle Padovani obtained a BA in archaeology from the University of Malta, followed by an MSc in human osteology and funerary archaeology from the University of Sheffield. In 2020, she joined Heritage Malta and is currently working as a member of the Archaeological Research Unit. So, Michelle, you're really welcome. Great to have you with us. And again, we're now slightly going to change scale by zooming into a specific country and a specific site. So thank you very much indeed. And to you.
Thanks for having me. So I'd like to introduce you to the site of Shroplagine. So this is in the country of Malta. For whoever hasn't heard of us, we're a very small island nation in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea. And this site is located on the southeast coast of the island. So you can see it circled in yellow in that map at the top. Now the site is very much at the very edge of a cliff, and that kind of shows in the image underneath. What's interesting about the site name is that Shroplagine loosely translates to mean pasta water. And this is because, are you seeing those white cliffs in the background? So after the rainfall, the rain washes these white cliffs into the sea, turning the color of the sea like a murky white, very much like pasta water. And I'd like you to keep that in mind when we're talking about the geology a little bit later on. Next slide, please. So the site was discovered in 1913, and what followed was a series of excavations, one in 1914 and another in 1915. And they did uncover basically a prehistoric megalithic structure. So what you can see on the left-hand side is the plan that they eventually surveyed of this structure. And you might notice that part of it, the part going beyond the coast, those dashed lines, that already fell into the sea 100 years ago. And in the reports, they were saying the collapse is absolutely imminent. So what happened then is that we lost track of the site. It got covered back up, and we honestly just thought it had already fallen into the sea. Next slide, please. But then in 2015, it was rediscovered. So they basically did this by kind of trying to match up the coast as was drawn 100 years ago to the coast as it is today. And they got like quite a nice match over there. And then they went on site and they did find some large stones, which they used a total station, and they tried to match it up with that original plan, and it looked quite promising. So after that, a committee was set up to kind of see how to deal with this structure at the very edge of a cliff. And their assessment was that there's really not much we can do for it at this point in keeping it there very longer. So they decided to actually try to bring it further inland. And that was a job that was given to Heritage Malta. Next slide, please. So we did some preliminary research, so some geological studies and some GPR. So the geology over here is Globigerina limestone. This is a very soft limestone. And there's actually two layers of it. The lower layer is softer than the upper layer. So what's happening is that the softer layer is being eroded by the sea, creating overhangs and caves. And eventually these overhangs collapse, and that is what is causing this cliff recession. And if you look at the GPR on the left-hand side of the presentation, you can actually see just how deep that cave is going into the cliffside. On the right-hand side, there are the faults marked out in red. And you might notice that there's one in particular that's parallel to the cliff edge. Yes, that's our main worry at the moment. Next slide, please. So in order to tackle this situation, in order to bring the stones back in, so we'd first have to expose the site, record everything, and then plan how to bring things further in. Now, there's a massive health and safety risk for personnel on site. But we had our very clever health and safety officers come up with a system in which there's a tower crane set up further inland in a much safer zone. From this tower crane, they've suspended this big metal platform, which has hooks coming down off of it. So we wear harnesses and we're strapped up to these hooks. And the idea is that if the floor ever caves from underneath us, we would just kind of dangle there for a while, and the tower crane operator would pull us back in. Next slide, please. So the first excavation season was in 2021, and we started with 2 trial trenches to kind of figure out, just to really confirm that the site is still there. Next slide, please. So this is a bit of a close-up of those trial trenches, and we did confirm pretty early on that there was a prehistoric structure on site. So as you can see here, we've got some really large stones, some megaliths, and you can kind of make out like a little bit of an apse shape already starting to come out. So that's actually one of the outer walls of the apses. Click, please. Over here, we're highlighting torba floors. So that's a system of flooring in prehistoric Malta, which uses crushed and then compressed limestone in order to create a floor level. Next slide, please. We've got some really nice worked megaliths already coming out, and one more. And this is a cylindrical stone artifact. It's really found at the very edge of the cliff. And that's what's interesting about this health and safety system, actually, is because 100 years ago, they didn't dare to excavate all the way at the edge of the cliff, while we have the equipment that we can go all the way. So even though they've removed a lot of those original deposits, at the cliff edge, we're still finding some original material, and this is one of the original artifacts. We're not really sure what it is, but we do have other examples of this artifact from similar prehistoric sites across Malta. So again, it's just further emphasizing that it is a Neolithic site, even though we couldn't quite figure out at this point which part of the structure we were in. Next slide, please. So the following season, we decided to open up into grids, and it really is starting to make a lot more sense now, and we were able to superimpose our plan over the plan that was drawn 100 years ago, and it's fitting quite nicely, actually, save for a few missing pieces here and there. And what's also interesting is that if you look at the coastline, it actually hasn't changed much in 100 years. So we're quite fortunate up to this point that it's still in place. But you can sort of see that there is a line going across part of the structure, and that is the fault, which is already starting to show. Next slide, please. So this is how we left the site in October. We can only work in summer because of the wind. So wind and tower crane is not a good combination. So it's really just a summer project. And over here, you can really see that fault coming across the site. And over there, there's also some land subsidence already happening. We did stick a measuring tape down there. It's over 1 meter deep, that hole. We've also lost a trowel to it, so we're not getting that back. So what conclusions we've reached at this point is actually that our original plan of being able to bring the whole structure further inland is actually very unrealistic. A lot of the walls are made of rubble. So even with all our 3D modeling, to be able to bring them in and then accurately reconstruct that as it was before is a little bit questionable. Even just when we're lifting the stone, there's so much erosion. Like sometimes we lift a stone and it just breaks. So it's not very realistic. So we have had to refocus. Could you click, please? So we are focusing on there we go. We're focusing on the larger stones now, the ones that we're quite confident we'll be able to bring further inland. And what we're doing is we're creating like a trench around it. At this point, the trench is almost ready. So by early next year, we should be able to start actually moving these stones further in. And the idea is that these will form part of an interpretation center just a little bit further inland. And then the rest of the site can be reconstructed through all the 3D modeling that we've been carrying out. What is really interesting is that we don't get this opportunity to actually see the construction phases of these structures. Unless, like in this case, it is going to collapse. This is the only reason we're being allowed to move part of the structure and see what's underneath. So this is actually a really unique opportunity to try see what's going on there. Next slide, please. And yes, it's just very much a race against time. We are kind of aware. Will you go back one? Thank you. We are very much aware that the site could disappear in a matter of seconds. So we are making plans for next year, and we will continue to make plans for the next year, but eventually there's not going to be a next year. And this image that you're seeing over here is actually a recent cliff collapse, just at the end of October this year. And our site is just to the left of the picture, while you can see the debris from the cliff collapse on the right of the picture. I just hope I'm not attached to that harness when it happens. But that's pretty much it. Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Michelle. That's brilliant. I could already see in the chat that a couple of people are saying that they're very, this is Lewis and Brian, very impressed with that safety system. So thanks very much, Izzy. That was really, really fascinating. Great to see, again, a focus on a particular site. So look, we only really have a couple of minutes for questions. We don't have a lot of time, because I'd really like to get on to the discussion. So really, we'll just take a couple of these. Where to start? Just a really quick one, I think maybe for you, Tony. Brian asks, may I know where you get the geograph data? Where is the source? Do you know a quick answer to that one? I don't know, Tony, if you can.
So the geographic data for Otago that I showed.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. So that data comes from a range of sources, mostly from our national mapping agency, LINZ, Toitu Te Whenua, Land Information New Zealand. And so elevation, that's based on LiDAR data. Other data sets on the resilience and exposure side come from our 5-yearly census. So, for instance, the working population ratio is reported by Meshblock or census tract. Actually, it's been about 25 years since I left the UK. Well, what do you call the smallest census unit in the UK these days? Anyway, that comes from Statistics New Zealand. Yeah. So a range of sources. Yeah.
Okay, thanks a lot, Tony. Right, so I'll just do one more question, and I've cut straight to the chase here. This is from Lewis Sharp, and I'll just focus a little bit on this one. I think this is maybe for Rob, talking about Hurst Castle. So the new coastal defences now installed following the partial collapse of the East Wing battery, that's at Hurst Castle, would presumably have prevented that collapse if they'd been put in place beforehand. So what prevented a decision to make the investment to mitigate a known and understood high risk? And what has changed at EH to prevent that again at another site? It's a very pertinent question. I don't know if you could do a brief answer, Rob, for that one.
Simple answer. Time and money.
Yeah.
So yes, we did recognise the risk to Hurst Castle for some time. We've been through various feasibility exercises to try and understand what is the best option for Hurst Castle. And the challenge of these things is that coastal defence is inevitably very, very expensive, quite a few £1 million. So we understood the issue, which is basically the loss of the shingle. We also had an issue that we recognise that the current defences that are there, not this stone one you can see, are coming to the end of their life. We had a initial partial collapse in 2019 along the west wing, where we were able to get in there and partly underpin the structure. So it's not entirely secure, but it's enough to actually hold it at the moment. And the intention was to do the same with the east wing, which is to get in and put in new defences as soon as possible. In between the work on the east wing, the west wing and the east wing came a small little thing called COVID, and everything stopped. So we then lost the window of opportunity to act because we got into winter. By the time we got into it was about February 2021, there were some serious structural failures in the east wing as well, where the structure had been undercut by the loss of the beach and loss of the shingle. And then it got to the point where it was just too dangerous to go anywhere near it. And then unfortunately it collapsed. And it collapsed very, very quickly. You know, within a week of structural failure being evidence, it'd gone. We were able to build these coastal defences on the back of a government scheme which was put in place, to stimulate the economy after COVID. There's a lot of money for heritage, and so we worked with Historic England and the DCMS here for Heritage, here for Culture Fund to act. And what these defences have done, at least secured the East Battery, the East Wing rather, and that'll give it 50, 60, 100 years worth of life. It's a very different question about what we can do on the West Wing, because the geography and the physical topography of the site is very difficult. It's less accessible. It's far more complex and therefore very, very expensive to act there. So the answer to the question is always, how much, you may recognize a risk, you may want to prepare for disaster. Can you persuade the funders? Can you persuade, the political masters, if you like, and the senior management to invest that level of expenditure at that time? It's not always easy. In this case, time started a march on us.
Indeed. Thank you, Rob. That's a very, very comprehensive answer to a very, very good question, I think. Okay, great.
It's a genuine why. Why don't people act?
Absolutely. Great, lovely. Well, thanks to all of you. They're fantastic presentations. I'm sure everyone agrees. It's been really, really enlightening hearing about the different approaches to risk. I think maybe what we'll do now then, given the time, we'll go straight to the discussion group. So I think we probably have about... breakout rooms close at 6:20. Or maybe, Kira, I wonder if we could have a little bit longer than that, perhaps.
I'll allow it, that's fine.
Yes, thank you very much. That'd be great. So what we'll do is just break into the groups now, and then you'll see those questions there, hopefully posted again in the chat for those groups when we do that. But this is a real opportunity for you to discuss not just what you've heard, but how the speakers particularly have challenged your thinking on these topics. And it would be really helpful. We do have some Padlet boards, or a Padlet board for you to access to type some notes if you want to record that discussion for us. That'd be really helpful. And we'll have a feedback all together when we come back together, probably in about 10 minutes time or so. So that'd be really, really useful. And by all means, again, if the speakers are in your groups, feel free to continue some of those discussions and questions if you like to. It'd be great to have a roundup just before, say, 6:25 for about 5 minutes. We'll just get an idea of what those key points are by group. But thanks. Okay, we'll see you in a minute then. Given the time, because we're right on it already, we'll just maybe start with a roundup. We had a really interesting discussion, actually quite fascinating, talking about lots of different things, including different case study sites. But one of the key themes that came through is the importance of including significance and value in the models or vulnerability assessments of cultural heritage, because that's sometimes maybe left out or not really given enough prominence. So that was something that could be looked at. And one of our speakers, I don't know if he's here, Juan, but there was a really, what seemed like a really excellent case study of a fort in Puerto Rico with some similarities to Hearst Castle, which we'll follow up on as well. So we'll see if there's something more that can come from that. But again, maybe a little bit more of a focus on Hearst Castle, the need perhaps to highlight vulnerability and risk of particular sites to maybe mount more of a sort of a public nationwide campaign, given sites that might be particularly at risk, whether that would be quite helpful in raising funding, for example. So lots of interesting ideas. And if anyone else from my group wants to add anything, feel free to do that for a minute or two. If not, we'll move on to maybe Rob might want to summarise for Paul from.
I'll do it very quickly. We talked briefly about the concept of reconstruction in the face of this kind of risk, and we did interesting to understand the sort of philosophy, conservation philosophy, and why you do that. We challenged Mary to say, well, would you move Skara Brae? And she did say, well, we hadn't thought about it, which I think was fascinating. Has sent a link on the chat. And I think I also raised the question I started with, are we using the same language? And actually, does it matter? Yeah. And I think the general sense of there is a common understanding. We may use terms slightly differently, but we're trying to get to the point where we understand it. And I also asked Heather about, okay, this is a fairly sort of, Western academic kind of approach to dealing with this. Is this a suitable way when you're dealing with different kind of communities? And again, it was the sense of, well, this is about dialogue and discussion and getting people to talk first. And Tony echoed that as well when we were talking about the terms that he was using. And I think that's the important thing, is that we don't want to sort of necessarily pin things down so it only means a very specific thing to very specific people. There has to be a sense of what are we trying to achieve, which I think is ultimately it's the understanding of what is risk. What is risk really telling us? How do we actually then make decisions on the basis of that risk? And if we can get to that point where we know enough about each other's approaches to get to that end point, I think that's very beneficial when we're looking at the scale we're now looking at in terms of this Coastal Connections program.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's really, really helpful. Again, if there's anyone from Rob's group who wants to chip in with anything, feel free. Now would be the time. No? Okay. Yes, Paul, please. Yeah.
Towards the end, Tony mentioned about veracity of data, and something I've thought about a lot in terms of trying to use data which may not have been measured for the purpose that you're using it for, but you're trying to relate it to something. I think that's a really important point. There's been an example I know with some of the data that I've used because it's logged for health and safety reasons. One site where they have, every time it rains, the site floods. They don't log it on the health and safety system because they'd be doing it so often. But then when I try and use that data, it's not raising that profile of that site to that risk. So it's really understanding and trying to help people understand that if it's been used for something else, that it's important to log those kind of events. So I think the veracity of data is really important as well, and can mask issues if you're not careful.
Yeah, and that's a very good point, isn't it? Because often the decisions are made on the basis of the veracity of that data, and again, good data leads to good decisions, but bad data, what does that lead to? Worse decisions, obviously. So garbage in, garbage out. Yeah, absolutely. No, that's been fantastic. And, again, I'm always, so encouraged every time we have these discussions. I know the time isn't always as long sometimes as we want, but it's always fantastic to get such a range of perspectives from around the world and different case studies. And we'll try and follow up on several of these. So I want to thank all of the speakers, of course, and all of you for continuing to participate in the discussions. And obviously also my colleague Kira, who's fantastic at putting the slides together and running everything within Zoom from behind the scenes so well. Really, really brilliantly done as usual. And what we'll do again is we'll put the recording of the workshop up as soon as we can. There are lots of recordings now from the other workshops up and ready on the Coastal Connections webpage, which you can find the link to in the chat. I would say as well that we are approaching the end of this first phase of Coastal Connections. So this is the 9th workshop. We will have a 10th workshop in the new year, conserving underwater heritage or conserving underwater and intertidal heritage, which promises again to be a really interesting one. That will be introduced by Lucy Blue, that many of you will know of. So we look forward to that. And also what we're doing at the same time is developing, as usual, our portfolio of and our compendium of case study fact sheets. So again, some of the case studies that we've heard about today, and obviously some others as well, we're developing those a lot more as well. Here they are, Kira. I was waiting for you to put that slide up. So these can be done very, very simply. It's just a case of answering some questions about site significance, the challenges, some of the processes involved, the solutions, and the outlook. And you create these with us. We basically create them, so you don't have to worry about the design or anything like that. You just have to answer some questions. But please get in touch if we're not already in touch with you about creating these, because there will be a fantastic resource that deals with the key issue of how climate change particularly is having an impact on coastal heritage, which is great to learn more about from the case study approach. So what shall I say next, really? Well, thanks again for joining us, and look forward to seeing you in the new year, and have a great time away if you're having a time celebrating Christmas or other holidays this festive period. Hope to see you next time. We look forward to seeing you then on the 23rd of January, back at the normal time of 4 p.m. GMT to 5:30 for conserving underwater intertidal heritage. But until then, thanks very much indeed. Great to have you with us. Thanks a lot.
Bye now.
Cheers.